Generation Z, more commonly referred to as the Zoomers, are oftentimes on the receiving end of criticism in real life and in cyberspace alike. The vitriol directed towards the Zoomers is a mixed bag. In many cases it is warranted, while in many others it is not. As a Zoomer myself, there are many things I dislike about my generation, but at the same time there are countless factors that caused the Zoomers to be the way they are, which the older generations fail to recognize. The intention of this video is not to assign blame to any one cohort for how the Zoomers turned out, for in truth, no one group is fully responsible. Rather, this video shall examine the life trajectory of the quintessential Zoomer, his behaviors, his attributes and beliefs, and the causes of and solutions to his generation's woes. Beginning with the question of when were the Zoomers born, there exists a degree of fuzziness as to the precise cutoff dates for the generations. Millennials, and older Zoomers in particular, frequently clash over the question of where the line is drawn. A general heuristic to know whether someone is a Zoomer or a late millennial is to ask whether or not that person remembers the 1990s. A Zoomer proper has no recollection of the 1990s if he or she was even born during the decade. Thus, the earliest cutoff for being classified as a Zoomer is around 1997. However, the vast majority of Zoomers were not born during the 90s, and instead were infants during the George W. Bush presidency. The youngest Zoomers, on the other hand, were born in 2010. When evaluating the Zoomers' early life, it is important to analyze the social, political, historical, cultural, and economic context of the 2000s. In terms of the social context, Zoomers grew up in an atmosphere in which the things that have provided stability for generations past, such as intact nuclear families and a sincere belief in religion, were deconstructed. Divorce rates were high, and religion was openly mocked and denigrated. The lack of intact families and the lack of meaning caused by deconstructing religion cannot be overlooked when discussing the Zoomers' formative years. Another social factor which also must be addressed is that the Zoomers had very few years to experience their childhoods before the advent of iPhones. Some older Zoomers were fortunate enough to know a world before screens and social media became ubiquitous, but for most Zoomers, these technologies proliferated the culture while they were young and impressionable kids. Many Zoomers began using iPhones and social media before they even turned 10 years old. Unsurprisingly, it is no wonder why so many Zoomer boys became addicted to video games and pornography, and why so many Zoomer girls developed body and gender dysmorphia. They were the first humans in all of history to be raised in the online world and reaped all of the negative consequences of social media and pornography, while their brains had not yet fully developed. In terms of the political and historical context of the 2000s, the Zoomers were born after the supposed good times of the 1990s came to an end. Politically, America was embroiled in foreign wars as a consequence of the War on Terror. 9/11 left a painful memory in the minds of most Americans, who believed their country to be untouchable. The government's reaction to 9/11 was to make America into a surveillance state and invest heavily into the military-industrial complex, resulting in forever wars in the Middle East. The Zoomers were the children who played with their toys as the casualty reports from Iraq were broadcast on TVs in their living rooms. Historically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, America stood as the world's only superpower, but with every year this enviable status waned. The subversion of the American empire at this point was thoroughly underway for decades. In schools, the Zoomers were indoctrinated by liberal teachers to see America as evil and eternally guilty for slavery. White Zoomer children were told over and over that white people were bad, white people have no culture, white people must atone to black people by denigrating themselves, and that above all, they should never be proud of their race. Conversely, ethnic minorities were told that the story of America revolves around their liberation from evil white oppressors. Blacks were encouraged to be proud of being black, but their white classmates were shamed for being white by the curriculum. White historical figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Christopher Columbus were viewed increasingly from a critical eye, while black historical figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. were portrayed as saints with no flaws. This segues neatly into the cultural context in which the Zoomers were raised. During the 80s and 90s, Americans were taught to be colorblind and to not see race. Gen X and the millennials were encouraged to view the question of race through this lens, but such was not the case for the Zoomers. The education and media that the Zoomers consumed actively taught them to see race through the lens of anti-whiteism. White culture was mocked, attacked, and called evil and racist, while forms of black culture such as gangster rap were glorified. It is worth stating that this is not new in American culture. But while anti-white messaging was present in American media for decades, older generations did not experience it as forthright and on the nose as the Zoomers did. Unfortunately, anti-white messaging was far from the only cultural malady with which the Zoomers were bombarded. Music, movies, TV shows, and other elements of popular culture became increasingly sexualized, hedonistic, and materialistic. One need only ask how many Zoomer girls listen to songs like California Girls or Last Friday Night play on the radio ad nauseum as kids. Young girls looked up to artists like Katy Perry and Kesha, who dressed scantily and sang songs mainly about getting drunk, having sex, and buying expensive commodities. Eventually, the glorification of drugs would be added to this list of maladies. Perhaps nowhere are the consequences of drug glorification more evident than in Gen Z's vape problems. The average Zoomer in high school could not go to the bathroom without encountering a circle of his classmates vaping in an effort to appear popular. The full effects of vaping have yet to manifest, but surely nothing good can come from breathing chemicals into one's lungs. Speaking from experience, other drugs besides nicotine were commonly used in bathrooms, but vapes were by far the most ubiquitous and ingrained in Zoomer culture. In terms of the economic context of the Zoomers' early lives, Gen Z were the kids when the 2008 recession rocked the American economy. The housing market was already in a terrible shape before the Zoomers even had their first jobs, but mass immigration during the 2010s would make the goal of buying a house 10 times harder for the Zoomers. The situation is so bleak that many Zoomers have given up on the hope of ever owning a home, and instead have resigned themselves to the miserable fate of being lifelong renters. Others have decided to live in their parents' basements until their 30s, and possess a complete lack of shame or any semblance of a drive to not be a loser. The housing market is not the only economic problem facing the Zoomer. Also worth discussing are the facts that wages have remained stagnant as inflation increased, and Social Security will collapse before the Zoomers retire. As for stagnant wages and rising inflation, this phenomenon is not new. Decades have gone by with millennials trying to explain this to boomers in vain. Nevertheless, Zoomers and Generation Alpha will be impacted harder than the millennials as time passes on and the trajectory of inflation grows ever more dismal. As for Social Security, the Zoomer is in the unenviable position of having a portion of his money, valuable money that he needs, taken out of his paycheck involuntarily to pay for the Social Security of the boomers. However, by the time the Zoomer is elderly and ready to reap his Social Security benefits, the program will be out of money, and he will be left holding an empty bag. All the while, he is told by boomers that bringing this up is quote-unquote whining, and that he just needs to pull himself up by the bootstraps. Not surprisingly, it is easy to see why the younger generations are so jaded about their situation. They are having money stolen from them in a cutthroat economy to pay for the boomers' Social Security, even though the same program will not be there for them, and all the while he is insulted by the boomer. These are the social, political, historical, cultural, and economic factors which define the environment in which the Zoomers were raised. With these in mind, we can now examine how they have resulted in the Zoomers being the way that they are. The most common criticisms of the Zoomers are that they are nihilistic, apathetic, lazy, sexually degenerate, and ignorant of basic knowledge. Let us address each of these in turn. Beginning with the nihilism and apathy of the average Zoomer, I do not contest the accuracy of this observation. Zoomers are nihilistic, hopeless, and checked out. The cause of this, as I have already mentioned, lies in the fact that the Zoomers grew up after past generations had already deconstructed the things which provided people meaning. Religion was deconstructed, racial and ethnic identity was deconstructed, the nuclear family was deconstructed, and the Zoomers were the children who grew up without these pillars of identity and meaning being present in their lives. Regarding the laziness of the Zoomers, This charge is often made against them by baby boomers and members of Gen X. As for this criticism's validity, it is the case that some Zoomers are lazy and perform their meaningless service jobs poorly. But they are, from my experience, not a good sample of the entire generation. Most Zoomers are working long shifts and trying to pick up a second job if they do not have one, but the economic cards that they are dealt are so stacked against them that they question why they even try. Most Zoomers are stuck wage slaving in unfulfilling, meaningless jobs for soulless corporations that hate them. The prospects of owning a house and having retirement money have been jeopardized by factors which are out of the Zoomers' control. Hence, it is not hard to see why so many Zoomers are or appear to be lazy at their jobs. Merely pulling themselves up by the bootstraps is not good enough to get a raise. As for the next charge, the older generations are absolutely correct to point out that most Zoomers are sexual degenerates. Zoomer women are promiscuous sluts, and Zoomer men are porn-addicted coomers. The causes for why they are the way that they are threefold. Firstly, the Zoomers either were not instilled with, or later abandoned, any moral precepts from religion about proper sexual ethics. Secondly, the media they consumed since they were children, but especially as they were teenagers, was hedonistic, degenerate, and sexualized. Thirdly, most Zoomer males were exposed to pornography during middle school or even earlier. Pornography is vile and poisons all minds, but it is especially harmful towards young and developing brains. The Zoomers have been bombarded with graphic, on-demand pornography in a way that no generation before them ever has. The only generation to be more impacted by the plague of pornography than the Zoomers are Generation Alpha. For Generation Alpha, the average age in which they view pornography is even younger than that of the Zoomers. This situation is extremely sad and rage-inducing, and should invoke white-hot anger in the minds of any sensible individual. The people who produce pornographic material, or defend its right to exist, should be held in the same esteem as a tapeworm. Finally, there is the criticism that the Zoomers are stupid and simply know nothing besides trivial pop culture references. This is absolutely true about some Zoomers, but is absolutely not the case about others. The educated Zoomer is one of the highest quality people you will ever know, but the masses of broccoli-haired idiots will make you want to bang your head against a wall. The cause of this is attributable to the failure of the American public education system and the rise of social media. The education system has taught Zoomers more about leftist platitudes than it has about math, and social media and iPhones have stunted many Zoomers' brains and annihilated their attention spans. In conclusion, Generation Z is a generation which has been dealt a profoundly bad hand. By no fault of their own, Zoomers have been born into an excessively degenerate society. However, the solution to the Zoomers' woes is not to embrace the nihilism which has come to characterize their generation. In order to rise above the things we have mentioned, the Zoomer must possess an inward vitalism and a heroic desire to triumph. Thus, rejecting the black pill is the most important decision a beleaguered Zoomer can make. If he does this, he may find that just as it is possible to win with 7 deuce, so too can a man win at life despite being born a Zoomer.